Shaping Foreign Policy. May I now request Mr. Prasad to present a copy of the book to Dr. Tharoor so that he can unwrap it.
Thoughtfully done, so it was not too difficult.
I did. Yeah, I did it. Making
I was got the information.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Friends, this is an important book on Indian Parliament and the role it plays in shaping foreign policy for our country. It's very fitting that Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who heads the Parliamentary Affairs Committee on External Affairs, is gracing the event and is chairing the event. May I now invite the author, Mr. Prasad, to tell us something about the book, how he came to write about it, and how long it took him to write the book, etc. Mr. Prasad.
that. Thank you, Venkatji, Dr. Tharoor, for agreeing to grace this occasion. Well, I've been associated with Parliament for 30 years. I started reporting Parliament from 1995 to when I was a reporting PTI. So, reporting Parliament was a big thing because only people with certain experience were allowed to come to Parliament. So it was a great occasion. And since then, I've had this great understanding of how the system works. The Parliament, I always believe, is a place where politics has to be negotiated to the process for it to become a policy in any manner. And then the process is important. So you need to understand the final processes that Parliament has in place. What actually took me to this book was something else. I spent 1 year working in the US Congress. I got a fellowship from Fulbright, and the fellowship was actually run by American Political Science Association. So I worked 1 year on the Hill, as they call it. And at that point of time, I realized how much of US Congress plays an important role in shaping their foreign policy. So I started looking at some of our intersections in Parliament. Of course, as a person who was a reporter and had to do a job, I could not spend too much time studying many of the debates and discussions. So the first thing I did when I got free from my daily routine as a reporter and as a journalist, in the sense I finished my formal innings in Tribune, my last place of work, I applied for a book grant to ICW. And I said I want to study the subject, and I would look at three specific constructs and three debates which I thought have shaped Indian Parliament's attitude and the work towards foreign policy. So I picked up three specific topics. I looked at the security angle, a debate on the peacekeeping force deployment in Sri Lanka, which became a very contentious issue between 87 and 90. That was one. The second, I looked at the economic aspect of how Parliament dealt with it. That was the WTO debate, because there were a lot of dispute and debate about how can the center barter away the rights of states, especially on the issue of agriculture, the other issues that were coming up. So parliamentarians were very agitated. So was a lot of reporters, so a lot of activities outside of Parliament. There were a lot of advocacy groups which were looking at it. If you remember, there was one very famous gentleman, S.P. Shukla, who used to run a campaign on against this. There was Gene campaign. There were many other issues, which I was also looking at as a reporter, reporting as a correspondent for PTI. So that was one debate. Again, that ran for a pretty long time. I mean, though we concluded, joined in 1995. India signed the to join WTO in 95, but the debate started actually during Rajiv Gandhi's time. And VP Singh, who was then the Commerce Minister, was the first person who went to in the first initial discussion. The third and crucial aspect of the debate I took was the one on the Indo-US nuclear deal, because I was reporting for Hindu at that point of time, and this debate was acquiring a lot of contours. And the thing was, there was so much of, there were a lot of technical, many people, just like the WTO debate, the debate on foreign, this particular issue was also an issue. People were not very happy. The left parties were happy. And instantly at that time, I was reporting for the Hindu. I was reporting the Congress party and the left parties. So it gave me a unique advantage of interacting with leaders on both sides and understand what exactly was going in the minds of it. And this, backed up by this, was my advantage when I got the Fulbright fellowship. And the Indo-US nuclear deal was also being debated in the US Congress. So I had really a ringside view, and I was working with a congressman called Jim McDermott, who was a Democrat and who was a staunch NPT guy, and he voted against the bill. So in fact, when I came back, one of your members of the Congress and later who was a member of minister, he said, "Why did we send you there? You could not convince Jim to vote." So I said, "Well, I didn't go to convince Jim. I went to pursue my work." And in that, I've added one more important aspect, which is again coming back to life now, the Civil Nuclear Liabilities Act, which today is being revisited. And it was the strong opposition at that point of time, heralded by the BJP and the left. They raised bars. The governments of the day have found it difficult to. Now, I think very recently it has been announced by the Prime Minister himself that we are going to bring about an amendment in this thing. So we are revisiting the subject, so it becomes all the more topical. I just took a small preface in this book about how the first Constituent Assembly legislative between 47 and 50 debated foreign policy because members of parliament were keen, they had a say in foreign policy. And by 50, when the provisional parliament began, we have Nehru assuring the members that I want a policy on discussion on foreign policy debated in every session. So that should be the thing. And much later, somewhere in the 80s, we have the then member of parliament from Rajya Sabha, went on to become a prime minister, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee, lamenting the lack of discussion on foreign policy in parliament. He said that used to be the convention. So we have these interesting issues that crop up. And of course, I also looked at the phrase where between in the provincial parliament, members were asked Prime Minister Nehru, why are you not putting members of parliament in delegations that go abroad? So Mr. Nehru at one point of time says, it is like below your dignity to apply for to be a member of a delegation prime minister. Very limited number of people go. And of course, in the last 1 year, I just remember, there was a question on how did you go to US? So he tells Parliament, I went to London. From London, the US president sent me a plane. So I traveled to US, courtesy the President of the United States of America, and he dropped me back. And this is my entourage. And he names my daughter Indira Gandhi, the company, but she was paid out of a private expense. It was not just. So that was the level of members of parliament asking Prime Minister Nehru, how did you open the chancery? Why did you buy that building? You did not come to the committee to take clearances. So that was the level of their interest in foreign policy, but it does continue. So that is the motivation for my book.
Thanks, Prasad. I should have done this in the beginning, but may I now invite my colleague, Mr. Narayanan, to introduce our distinguished guests.
Okay, thank you, Venkat. I don't think Dr. Padu need an introduction to this audience, but however, just for my make it, I'll just introduce. He's an author, politician, former international diplomat. Dr. Shashi Tharoor's come to from different worlds of knowledge. At present, member of parliament, he represents the parliamentary constituency of Trivandrum, my own state, in the Lok Sabha. And he is also at present the chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee of External Affairs. He has previously chaired the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs also. And Mr. K.V. Prasad, he is the senior journalist who has many years of experience with the PTI, and you have heard about him right now. So I'll stop here. So let's start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. May I now invite Dr. Tharoor to chair the session and carry on with the proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Venkat, and it's very good to be here. When Mr. Prasad came and told me about his book, I was absolutely fascinated. Because way back when I wrote my PhD thesis in the States in 1977, 78, I had a chapter on the role of Parliament in the making of foreign policy at that time. And at that point, it was literally the only thing written on the subject, as far as anyone could find in the preceding several decades. So when I discovered that Mr. Prasad had authored an entire book on the subject, I was utterly fascinated. I would say that he's done a remarkably interesting job. There's a certain amount of historical context. There are the fairly detailed studies of three particular incidents, namely the Indian peacekeeping force that went to Sri Lanka and the debates about that, the whole nuclear issue, and of course the question of the accession to the World Trade Organization. These are the three cases that Mr. Prasad has taken up, and he's gone into it in some depth. Of course, the last of those is already more than a decade ago, and therein lies a tale, which I'll come to in a minute. If you look at the history, I think I would say that one conclusion is inescapable, and I came to the same conclusion almost 50 years ago when I did my doctoral thesis, and that was that Parliament has saved much more as a forum for debate, for imparting legitimacy to policy through parliamentary discussion, rather than a decision-making body. In other words, governments came to Parliament when they had to, particularly when laws were involved, but there was not necessarily any yielding to members of Parliament on decisions that the government felt were theirs to make. Under Nehru, the government was very welcoming of criticism and critiques generally, but of course, direction of policy was not directly. Shastri's brief era also saw strategic direction and discussion, but the executive again remained firmly in control. In the case of Indira Gandhi, she would have used these parliamentary discussions and debates to reinforce general policy directions and principles, peace, for example, and once again, decisions of the government. Ultimately, one can conclude that Parliament had a role in public discourse, in shaping public discourse and protecting public discourse on foreign policy, which conveyed what I would honestly describe as the illusion of oversight. But in practice, the executive has driven policy through all governments. And I stress this simply because I know Mr. Prasad went and spent a bit of time in the US Congress, where it's very different, where the impact of individual congressmen, individual representatives on policy decisions and on initiating legislation gives them a clout we don't have in our system, because in our system, only the government initiates legislation. And it's only through legislation that parliamentarians can actually impact policy. I might add that the question of the recurrent tensions that exist in the balance between debates about national sovereignty versus international commitments, some of the issues he's taken up in his book, the trade-off between economic liberalization, for example, and domestic political priorities on, say, the WTO debate. The question of whether during the Indo-US nuclear deal, the negotiations over the law actually undermined the effectiveness of the deal. In fact, as you know, the nuclear liability law in the end was modified considerably from the first draft that Manmohan Singh brought in order to accommodate not just the objection to the BJP, but also some of the allies within the UPA government. And the result was a law that remained a dead letter No one has actually ever come into India thanks to the nuclear liability law. That's why Mr. Modi is not talking about amendment. And then the question of WTO negotiations. They gave Parliament a forum to reflect the diverse ideological stands and positions available in our country's polity, but they did not actually change policy in any sort of decisive manner. And the shaping of public discourse is not to be poo-pooed, it's a valuable thing in any democracy. The role of Parliament in actually articulating ideas that reflect the public temper should not be underestimated. Um, Even if you can afford to neglect parliamentary debates, they do shape the government's thinking to some degree because they become aware of the political cost of certain decisions, the domestic political cost of certain decisions, and that will at least indirectly affect and influence the calculations of the executive. So broadly speaking, one would argue that these debates do play something of a role by mirroring broader domestic political dynamics. But this is where the challenge comes up. And I must say, Mr. Prasad acknowledges this towards the end of the book, which is that the story depends very much on two factors. He hasn't spelled this out explicitly, so I'm drawing this inference and from my own experience as well. The first is, does the particular policy decision require the passage of a law? Because that is what obliges the government to bring it to Parliament and have a discussion on it. If no law needs to be passed, if something can be done as an executive decision, most governments would prefer not to bring it to Parliament. The second question then is, if a law does need to be passed, are you a single party majority in Parliament, as Mr. Modi's government now is? Are you a tenuous coalition with people of very many different views, as UPA 1 was, and to some degree UPA 2 also became? Are you a party with such a strong opposition that the opposition's resistance can actually scupper a piece of legislation? All of these factors have a much greater bearing on whether Parliament has an impact on an outcome than anything else. So when Indira Gandhi had a crushing majority, or now that in the first two terms of the BJP government, you not only can get away with whatever you want to do, in the case of Mr. Modi, has essentially refused to bring pretty much any foreign policy issue for discussion. The last debate on the MEA took place in UPA 2. So when you think about it, there was one discussion on the demands for grants of the MEA in which I participated in the first term of Mr. Modi's government. Otherwise, no foreign policy issues come forward, despite the opposition's frequent demands for it. For example, when the Galwan incident happened in 2020, 3 years earlier when the Doklam incident happened in 2017, the opposition consistently submitted adjournment motions calling for a discussion. The government had the strength, the numbers, and of course the certain political will simply not to permit those discussions. So it has been a matter of some chagrin that on these matters no discussion has taken place. There was a discussion on India's stand on Ukraine soon after the Russian invasion in February. I remember speaking in Parliament on that subject, perhaps the only dissenting voice to the stand we had taken at that time. But again, the outcome of the debate was essentially meaningless because neither was a law required, nor was any policy decision influenced by the outcome of the debate. It was meant to be an opportunity for the government to point to its sending humanitarian aid to Ukraine and its evacuating the Indian students. So in other words, Parliament became a forum to demonstrate, as it were, something of value for the government's publicity or propaganda machine. It was not at all to actually discuss the merits of policy, though I was one of those who used it for that purpose. There was no obvious need to do that, and many speakers focused on the two issues the government was interested in. Now, I will pause there, but I say all this to make the point that, by comparison, certainly with the US Congress, which Prasad has seen at close quarters, we have a very limited impact. In fact, even the so-called activity called parliamentary diplomacy, which many other parliamentary systems encourage their MPs to conduct, we are much more hobbled because I chair the only foreign affairs committee of any parliament in the democratic world that is not allowed to travel abroad. So we deal with foreign countries. We receive other countries' foreign affairs committees regularly, but we cannot go abroad. The only parliamentarian who travels abroad and takes MPs with him if he wants to is the Speaker himself. But he doesn't take the Foreign Affairs Committee, and the Foreign Affairs Committee as such doesn't go. So we are very much sort of shown our place. Now, I have actually tried to open this particular can of worms by going to the foreign minister and seeking his blessing as well as that of the Speaker for the Foreign Affairs Committee to go on. I've said, obviously, this is not going to be done on the committee's own whim. We will do it in consultation with the government and in terms of where it serves and doesn't undermine any Indian foreign policy interests. So when many members of the committee expressed a desire to go to Bangladesh, we gently pointed out that Bangladesh doesn't actually have a functioning parliament. So who are you going to meet when you go there? But there are other neighboring countries that you might find some suitable place that the government might be willing to, but we still need the Speaker's consent, which so far has not been forthcoming. So this is broadly speaking the context of my response to the book. But I thank Prasad for writing a book on a very neglected subject. Not just neglected, it's largely untilled ground, and certainly I'm not aware of any other book on the role of the Parliament in Indian foreign policy making. I myself have addressed occasional meetings of the Bureau of Parliamentary Studies and Training in the Parliament Library on this theme. Even there, the greatest interest has been on training new parliamentarians as to how they can have any role on parliamentary diplomacy and foreign policy, rather than too many illusions about Parliament being a decision-making body when it comes to foreign policy. And I'm being ruthlessly honest here because I think it's important we all understand our systems are not the same as other countries' systems. And certainly, it would take once again a situation where we have a relatively weak coalition government before any parliamentary debate can actually influence a political decision. And it would take, once again, only in a situation where a law needs to be written and passed, whether it's for a treaty, whether it's for a particular decision. But as you know, we have very, very few foreign policy issues that come before Parliament. And therefore, the opportunity to shape the outcome of a decision still remains very limited. I think we can both take questions on this, but that's probably where I would leave my remarks.
Yes.
Dr. Tharoor, we have always heard and read that the basic framework of our foreign policy remains intact, always. Over the past 1 decade, have you, what's your observation, especially dealing with our immediate neighbors? This government's policy is a bit hawkish, or they're shifting? Thanks.
Say in all honesty that our foreign policy has by and large been consistent with differences of emphasis and differences of style. And there have been moments which have not reflected well on this government, and there have been moments in the past where you could debate the conduct of previous governments. But the broad strategic orientation has not changed. When it comes to the neighborhood in particular, any Indian, Pakistan is almost a special case. But let me just say, in the neighborhood in general, any Indian government starts off with the classic disadvantage of its size. That is that whenever you put South Asian countries around the table, it accounts for 70% of the population and 80% of the GDP. So you can't be India without displacing weight that makes other people uncomfortable. And this situation reminds me of the famous crack. I mean, we have the Argentinian ambassador here, but the old Mexican president 100 years ago, Porfirio Diaz, famously said, "My poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." Now, you could well imagine many of our neighbors saying the same thing about India. We loom larger than divine when it comes to our presence in their lives and the shadow we cast. And therefore, I argued during my brief stint in the foreign ministry that we had an obligation to promote asymmetrical relations. This was partly the theme of my Lal Bahadur Shastri Memorial Lecture 2010, which I'm sure you can find on the internet, where I made the case that Indian public opinion had to accept that we had a certain obligation to give more than we expected back in return from our neighbors because precisely we were bigger, more populous, richer, more powerful, all over it. Now, that is not whether it's us or whether it's the BJP. When it comes to the BJP, there have been some also, I would argue, mistakes of persistent style. Nepal is actually a better example than Pakistan because in the case of Nepal, we were reacting to domestic developments in Nepal in a manner in which it looked very much like we were leaning too heavily on Nepal. Now, I cannot sit here and say we wouldn't have done that had we been in power, but I certainly think that whoever would have done it would not have been a good thing, and it cost us in Nepali public opinion. So happened that the Prime Minister of the time, who's again Prime Minister now, called me a couple of times since I was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee to plead his case with me. But it's also true that that I got a fair amount of denial from the then Foreign Minister, Sushma Swaraj, when I spoke to her about things. So this is all history already now, it's 10 years ago, but there have been moments like that. There have been moments in more recent times with other neighboring countries where the perception on the part of those countries has been that perhaps we were unduly heavy-handed to them, and that's true of several countries. Pakistan is a different area where I honestly think that all governments of any Indian party that have ruled have all started off with an approach that privileged peace because every Indian government concludes very early on that it's in our interest not to have our own domestic development and economic growth interfered with by conflict with Pakistan, and therefore let's have peace. And almost always the disillusionment has come because of initiatives from the other side of the border, such as, for example, I often remind people that 26/11 didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the middle of a peace offensive. Shah Mahmud Qureshi, the Pakistan foreign minister, was in Delhi negotiating an even more liberal visa regime than already existed the day that this thing happened. I heard from the then Pakistani ambassador in Washington, who, as an independent scholar and journalist, is a friend of mine, who told me that a very senior Pakistani intelligence man was visiting Washington. He watched the news on television and said, "Ye hamare log hai, lekin hamari operation nahi." But that was so. Whether you believe that or not, many governments have come to the painful conclusion that whether you want peace or not, you don't have a partner for peace on the other side. Because any civilian government that wants to make peace is unable to deliver that peace. And any hardline government that is there is unwilling to deliver. So between unable and unwilling, India either way has to be prepared. So it's been a very hard learning. And many of us who may start off instinctively as peaceniks. I mean, after all, was a UN man for 29 years, and I stood very much for peace most of my adult life. I too feel I've been mugged by reality. And 26/11 was a particularly painful wake-up call because India was so completely blameless and the act was so completely devoid of provocation that there is nothing that can be said in the situation of it. And one could say similar things about what happened when Mr. Modi went to Pakistan in December of 2015 and was rewarded by the attack on Pathankot, followed by the attacks on Uri and Siddhartha. And finally, the disillusionment that sets in. I mean, you may remember, and this is worth reminding people, that even after the Pathankot attack, Mr. Modi was in disbelief that the Pakistanis could have done this to him after all the friendship and warmth of the Nawaz Sharif wedding and birthday celebration. So he invited the Pakistani ISI to join the investigation into the attack, which created astonishment in the military circles of our country. I know because I knew some of these gentlemen. What does the Prime Minister do? And then what did the Pakistanis do? They came, they looked around our air base, they found whatever the information they want to find, and they went back to Pakistan and said the Indians did it to themselves. I mean, after that, can you blame Mr. Modi for his total distrust of Pakistan? I mean, ultimately, I remember writing in one of my novels, in fact, not even one of my non-fiction books, about how the problem with India and Pakistan is they shout cease and fire at different times. And the truth is that yes, I mean, this is precisely it. Whenever we have been ready to make peace, somebody on that side has been willing to disrupt it. And whenever they have been desperately keen on making peace, as I know from various anecdotal examples that they were, we had completely lost trust and Mr. Modi was not prepared to reciprocate. So the gestures made, for example, by the Pakistanis around 2019, 20, I mean, just before COVID, they were really very keen. And this included the Pakistani military. But at that point, we were not prepared to be receptive. So I would say this is not an example of the government becoming harsher, because any government of India would have to take into account the realities of that time. But I will say that Dr. Manmohan Singh approached peace with Pakistan with a genuine commitment towards peace. And he was betrayed by 2611. Mr. Modi, in turn, having attacked Dr. Manmohan Singh's policy, remember the chicken biryani attacks on the UP and so on, then proceeded to go the other extreme by inviting Nawaz Sharif to his inauguration, sending saris to Nawaz Sharif's mother, and then going himself to Nawaz Sharif's birthday, which is also the granddaughter's wedding. And then what happens? He got also betrayed. So you have to understand that in every case, the governments of India that have been taking a hard line on Pakistan have been forced into it by Pakistan. In both these examples, make my argument. So on this issue, I don't think there is any political difference between the two parties. We all have to be realists on these matters.
So to do with Bangladesh, the current wait and watch policy that's been in operation, do you think it's the right one in the context of what's happening at a fast pace out there in Bangladesh?
Well, I think what's happening in Bangladesh is something we have to watch closely and carefully for the obvious reason that they are right next door to us. And anything that happens there will have some significant implications. If we want to be using sort of American language, they are in many ways in the soft underbelly of India, and we could be very vulnerable if a hostile government were to come to power. I don't think the present interim government can be described as hostile. But at the same time, there is a certain wariness in approaching what's going on. Equally, we've seen a certain amount of Indian media hysteria, if that's not too strong a word, about the mistreatment of minorities. There have certainly been attacks on Hindus, on Indian institutions like the Indian Cultural Center, statue of the Pakistani surrender to India in 71 and so on, which have been vandalized, destroyed. But many of the other attacks, many Bangladeshis of goodwill explain that these are attacks on Awami League supporters who happen to be Hindu, rather than attacks on Hindus because they are Hindu. But if you read Indian media coverage, by and large, we don't see that. We see it as attacks on Hindus. So these are some of the issues which Bangladeshis remain very concerned about. And I will say I get people reaching out to me from Bangladesh all the time saying, what can we do? How do we get our message across? And I've tended to convey the view that I think it's very much up to people in authority in the interim government to give the government of India the necessary assurances, publicity exercise that needs to be done. Now, on the larger question of what we should do, I think we have very few choices. We can wait and watch and see what happens. We should obviously not obstacle to whatever domestic arrangements Bangladesh chooses to make to ensure a transition to a more durable situation. We are somewhat in a cleft stick when it comes to the statements being issued by former Prime Minister Hasina, because certainly we have absolutely no choice but to extend our hospitality and shelter to her. If we did not show the same loyalty to a friend and ally that she showed us when she was in power, then why would anyone want to be our friend and ally in future? So I don't think anyone would challenge the government's extension of that courtesy, that hospitality. To Hasina, certainly my party would not challenge that. We welcomed Hasina to India. But having said that, certainly some of her statements have led to complicated matters with the government of Bangladesh. At the same time, as a cleft step, you can't do one thing, we can't do the other thing. We just have to sort of reassuring signals everywhere. But one thing I will stress, or two things I will stress. One is we should do nothing overtly or covertly that implies interference in the internal affairs of Bangladesh. We have every legitimate interest in the external affairs of Bangladesh when it affects us, but not in the internal affairs. They have the right to determine their own political arrangements. And secondly, we should keep uppermost the interests of the people, the well-being of the people of Bangladesh, rather than convey in any way the impression that we are more concerned about either a particular political party or tendency or about a particular community. We, as a friendly neighbor, should signal at all levels that our commitment is to the well-being of the people of Bangladesh. These two would be my cardinal yardsticks in terms of guiding policy.
If your party has been in power, what would it do to improve relations with China and Pakistan in particular? Dr. Tharoor?
Well, again, with Pakistan, as I said, we've been mugged by reality, and I'm afraid in the case of China, after Galwan, it's very difficult to have anything but a position of mistrust towards China. And I can't speak for the party because there is a separate foreign affairs cell in the party that advises the party president, and I am the chairman of the Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee, but not the party. So I'm not speaking for the party. Let me just say, in any case, I'm speaking in an individual capacity because, as chair of the committee, we don't deal with the media officially. We give you a briefing telling you we're having a meeting on this subject. We don't even tell you what was discussed in the meeting until the report comes out, whether if there is a report to Parliament. So in this case, there is no report to Parliament now. I can partially answer that question by pointing you to the report authored by the Standing Committee on External Affairs when I was last chair on relations with China in 2019, which point to certain directions. It's a public document. It's on the Lok Sabha website. Even though it was 6 years ago and it was a year before Galwan, nonetheless, it's worth looking at. On Pakistan, again, we did a report of the committee when I was in the chair, in which I'm so sorry that it stood up. But anyway, when it comes to Pakistan, at that time we had advocated that the mistrust of the government on certain strategic aspects of the relationship was entirely warranted because of the events of the preceding years. But the committee advocated an improvement in people-to-people relations, particularly opening up visas to segments of Pakistani society. And the argument which we made then, which I'll repeat today, is that undoubtedly it is in our strategic interest to help create a constituency for peace in Pakistan. And I'm yet to meet a Pakistani who has been to India and not fallen in love with our country. There may be some people who are official haters who've come on official conferences, but the average tourist, the average visitor, the average singer, musician, sportsman, whatever you meet who has been to India, they absolutely love the place, want to come back, wish they could spend more time here, and so on. So if you want to create a constituency of goodwill in Pakistan, give them more visas, would be my thoughts.
Dr. Tharoor, Vijay Joshi, PTI.
Yes, of course, Vijay.
Hi. The Prime Minister is headed to Paris first and then Washington, where he'll be meeting President Trump. If you, as policy advisor, what would you tell him on how to deal with this new president who seems to have turned diplomacy, global diplomacy on its head? And how challenging is it going to be for India to deal with the new United States?
Look, before I answer that, let me say that the first part in Paris is also worth briefly touching upon, because I think it's a matter of satisfaction that our Prime Minister will co-chair the AI summit. Some of you may have seen a few days ago an op-ed I wrote urging India to take a more proactive role on AI regulation, in particular, lamenting the fact that it still doesn't have an AI safety institute, whereas most of the advanced economies do. And there is already an international network of AI safety institutes, which is sitting together and discussing policy. And I said, we have to be at the table. In fact, as the saw goes, if you're not at the table, you'll end up on the menu. So if you want to have an important role on AI, which of course India does, we are very major users of AI already. We have a huge tech community that's interested in AI. We need to be present as regulations are drafted, as policies are made, and as international covenants begin to be agreed at, arrived at. And therefore, I would urge all of you who haven't read it to just Google my piece in the Hindu, which I think was on Monday last week, or just a few days ago anyway, that makes this case very powerful. I'm very glad by actually co-chairing the summit that India's voice will be heard in the shape of the Prime Minister's voice in Paris at one of the major international gatherings at governmental level on AI. So that's an important point worth making, which somehow people in our country, to my surprise, are not paying enough attention to, at least to me. So in this club, I want you all to pay attention to that. It is actually an important initiative and something that we should be very satisfied with. The US, of course, the defining feature of the Trump administration so far has been its unpredictability, and in particular the fact that there is so little respect for the building blocks of international order that we have all been schooled in and grown up with and lived with since the Second World War. When you realize that, for example, one of the axiomatic principles of international affairs has been state sovereignty and the inviolability of borders, how do you react to having a president who wants to make a sovereign country his 51st state, who wants to make another sovereign country surrender a large chunk of territory to it, and so on and so forth? That is completely new. Similarly, we've been in a world where certainly from about 1980 to about 2010, the direction has been towards greater trade and liberalization and reduction of tariffs. Now we have an American president who talks about tariffs with every second breath, and who has been using tariffs already, or the threat of imposing, the announcement of imposition of tariffs in foreign policy with his own immediate neighbors. And so we are in a situation where a number of the basic assumptions of international affairs and of classic diplomatic contact are simply no longer the assumptions that we can take for granted in this particular relationship with this particular president. Obviously, India values the relationship with the United States. It's a relationship that has honestly transcended whichever parties in power, either here or there, because it has featured so far both the UPA government and the NDA government on the BJP government on this side, and it has featured both Democrats and Republicans as president on that. And there's been a consensual approach on Indo-US relations. So certainly there should be every desire to see that continue. But clearly, when the agenda for discussion comes up, there are already some potential areas of controversy. Mr. Trump has publicly referred to India as one of the worst offenders when it comes to protectionist tariffs, which perhaps we are in some areas. And the Prime Minister will have to decide if his government is prepared to rethink its approach to tariffs, because if Mr. Trump is absolutely determined to impose retaliation on some of the tariffs that India has come up with, then certainly there is going to be a genuine challenge, because our exports will be affected if they're no longer going to benefit from a relatively light US approach on tariffs to India. A second, two other areas of sensitivity that have just arisen. One is, of course, not so much the deportations of illegal Indian immigrants, which is entirely appropriate, but the manner of the deportation, which has naturally caused a great deal of anxiety, resentment, and even anger in India. And somehow the message will delicately have to be conveyed behind closed doors that this must be never repeated. Having Indians arriving in their homeland in handcuffs has not played well with anyone in the political spectrum, including, quietly and privately, including members of the ruling party. But I say in all honesty that we have two things should be absolutely beyond argument. Number one is, if you've gone illegally to a foreign country, the country has a right to deport you home. And secondly, if your identity and your nationality is not disputed, if your identity is proven to be, India has an obligation to take you back. Those two things are beyond debate. And therefore, that's not where the argument should lie. The argument should lie, treat our people with respect, because that's how we would treat your people if we were expelling any nationals of yours from our country. similarly treat ours. They're not criminals, rapists, murderers, whatever. They're illegal immigrants, and once they've left your soil, they don't need to be handcuffed, and they certainly don't need to be mistreated. So that, I think, is one way. The second sensitive issue that has just arisen is the American decision yesterday, I think it was, or day before, to remove the waiver that India was benefiting from in helping develop the Chabahar port in Iran. Now, for India, this was a very important strategic port. Number one, because it gave us an opportunity, for example, to get goods into Afghanistan when very good relations with Afghanistan without having to go through Pakistan. That was one thing. Secondly, we had constructed the Zara and Zelaram highway in Afghanistan, and Chabahar would have given us a direct access from the west to that highway, and we would have again been able to go. Now, of course, the Afghanistan relations have been complicated by the rise of the Taliban to power there, but given that Afghanistan government is also having problems with Pakistan, it's still a very important opening and access for us. Secondly, through Chabahar, there's access to the Iranian market and to parts of Central Asia. And thirdly, if we weren't there, the Chinese were very keen on developing Chabahar themselves. So we have all sorts of strategic calculations behind our involvement in Chabahar. And that's why we had requested and received a waiver on the American sanctions on Iran and the development of Chabahar port. And that waiver has been removed rather abruptly and, to the best of my knowledge, without any forewarning to India. So perhaps that is again a thing that may need to be raised. But I will say to you, Vijay, these are matters that most governments would prefer to discuss behind closed doors. These are not matters that we're going to hear, I think, a lot about publicly until some agreement has been reached. On the larger questions that have been dominating the headlines here, the Indian migrant workers in America, H-1B visas, all of those things, those may be read publicly, but there, I think, so far, the school of thought that Mr. Trump represents, the Make America Great Again lobby, as it were, that school of thought has been somewhat divided because there are many who don't want foreigners coming in and taking away the jobs of white Americans. But there are many, and most notably the most influential people, such as Mr. Elon Musk himself, who feel very strongly that that approach that attracts people of talent from foreign countries to America is indispensable for America's greatness, to use that word. And therefore, they are not going to succumb to the more nativist or even racist opposition to India on H-1B visas. And I think, again, we should let this debate play out there, but certainly we should indicate that we have certain interests at stake in all of this. I still feel that as an Indian, I would rather see Indians stay in India and make India prosper, make India great again, rather than making America great again. But I don't want Indians to be denied the opportunities that they have so far enjoyed, which have indirectly benefited India too, because as Indians do well and prosper in America, they stay connected to India, and they have also helped in the development of certain Indian IT sector industries and so on. But broadly speaking, these I would see as the big ticket issues. The only thing that none of us know is whether some unpredictable issue may come up off the cuff from the president that the prime minister will have to cope with and respond to on the spot. But in terms of what he can go with some preparation, these I think would be behind closed doors and publicly that he's bound to have to address.
Yeah. Back, Shashi, to your 29 years at the UN. Had you been elected as Secretary General of the UN, looking back, how different would the world be? What would have happened in Iraq, Gaza, you name it?
You know that I'm not going to answer counterfactual like that, Venkat. I mean, that's unwise. In fact, one of the reasons I declined Ban Ki-moon's very kind invitation to remain in the UN is precisely because I felt that once I had run and lost, it was not right for me to be in a position where I would cast a second. And look, I mean, he had his 10 years. Since then, Guterres has had 9 of his 10 years, or 8.5. So a lot of water has flown under many bridges. And I don't think it would be right for me to sit here and say that the world has been a challenging place. I think if you compare the Kofi Annan era, of which I was an intimate part, with the years that have followed, I think two things that strike people all the time is one, that the UN is a good deal less visible on the big ticket issues in terms of public consciousness. Kofi was very good at making the public aware of the UN taking up certain issues and at the same time persuading them that the way in which the Secretary General was articulating those issues was the right way to think and go. And very often governments came along with him and behind him. And he was able to move the envelope on a number of key issues, which, to be very honest, I've not seen very much of since his time. So that's one significant factor. The second was that he was much bolder in his willingness to think outside the box and to almost challenge governments to take new initiatives. And one striking example was the very first time President Clinton threatened to bomb Iraq in 1998. Within 24 hours, Kofi Annan got on a plane and went to see Saddam Hussein. And I know because I was with him on that trip, and I was in Iraq myself, and I must say it was not a welcome initiative to the P5, but they felt the Secretary General had the right and the authority to attempt to intervene in that manner to stave off the war. And though he actually succeeded in persuading Saddam at that time to cooperate with the with the UN weapons inspectors, thereby Mr. Clinton held off on the bombing for the next 8 or 9 months. Subsequently, later refusal to cooperate led Mr. Clinton to start the bombing that he had earlier threatened, but this time without threatening it. He just said enough is enough and bombed. There was no time for Kofi Annan to implement it again. But I'm just saying it was an example of an initiative. We never saw such an initiative being taken by the Secretary General when for 7 weeks the British and the Americans were declaiming from every available rooftop that the Russians were amassing troops and were about to invade Ukraine. I am unaware of any peace initiative that was undertaken either by or on behalf of the United Nations at that time. I'm pretty sure that Kofi would have handled that differently. So that would be a second major area of comparison. But at the end of the day, the world is what it is, and we have to live with what we find around us and in the media. So too many hypotheticals don't take us very far, especially not in front of the.
Yes, Sandeep. You have a question? Okay. Yes, please. Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor. I'm Kunal from PTI. I have a first clarification on your statement and then two short questions. Did you intend to say that it's an illusion among the people that foreign policies are discussed in Parliament or among the policymakers or both? And my question is in two parts. One is on Bangladesh. You mentioned that India must very carefully look at what is happening in Bangladesh. Do we sort of the fermented situation in Bangladesh and the attacks that are happening and the situation around Hasina? Or is it because what we are seeing, the ostensibly growing proximity between Dhaka and Islamabad? Is that why you should look at it more carefully?
Both. Now, the first one on the question, what I'm saying is there should be no illusions about the fact that legislators can make policy. We can influence laws when there is a government that is vulnerable to our influence, such as a coalition government or a government dependent on other parties or a government facing a very strong opposition, etc. Then, and where a law is required, because many policies don't require laws, right? But when it comes to foreign policy per se, let's say the Galwan incident, let's say the Oklam incident, we have not even a statutory provision in our constitution that allows Parliament to ratify treaties. So we don't even have a rule under the constitution to tell the government, you can do this, you can't do that, you can make this peace, you can't make. We can only question. Sometimes in the parliamentary committees, we can ask certain questions. Even there, if a law is brought to a committee, we can go into it and otherwise, at best, it's a briefing, some questions, some discussion, we move on. There's a handful of topics on which the Parliament can write public reports to, where the committee can write a public report to Parliament. But those are rarely to do with immediate, urgent, headline-grabbing issues. They're larger, broader themes that we try to address, and which committees have done in the past. So I'm saying don't have any illusion that, say, a foreign policy decision, an opening to Pakistan, a peace with China, an intervention in a neighboring country, those things are not decided by parliamentarians, they're decided by governments, by the government of India. And let's not have any illusions to the contrary. On Bangladesh, as I said, both those aspects are very important. And I even mentioned a third one, that don't forget that if anything goes seriously wrong, that Bangladesh could be our soft underbelly. That is the place where you're most vulnerable, because it's not under your control, it's a foreign country, but a lot of damage can be done to you from there. That's what the expression implies. So you have to be attentive, you have to be careful, you have to be conscious, you have to be on your guard. And frankly, you have to cultivate good relations with whoever is in power there. And that's true of any bilateral relationship. You don't get to choose who rules a particular country. You have to learn to work with them. And that's something we have to do.
And my second question was, sir, about Pakistan. Foreign Minister Jaishankar, in one of his public statements, has said that the era of uninterrupted dialogue with Pakistan is over. And I think the government of the day has time and again asserted that talk and terror don't go together. You seem to be one of the doves here among the hawkish environment when you said that if you had to create a constituency where we can have a select group of visa coming to broadly define that category of people who are very amenable to India. But do you see that doable? I mean,
first of all, I actually agree with the foreign minister that uninterruptible dialogue is not possible, because you cannot but react. For example, if we were in the process of such a dialogue when 26/11/2008 happened, obviously we were interrupted. How can you talk to people whose territory has been misused, whose institutions and military and intelligence have been kill your people in that such large numbers and invade your sovereignty? You can't just continue talking as though nothing has happened. So, of course, uninterrupted dialogue is not possible. Whether dialogue should be completely suspended for all time is absurd. I mean, not talking is also not a policy. But for the moment, we have not seen evidence to justify a major resumption of official dialogue. But I have said, and I've gone on record in my previous role as chairman of this committee 5 years ago, that yes, people-to-people friendship would help us to create a broad constituency for good relations with India in Pakistan. A constituency in Pakistan for good relations with India, which is in our interest. That's the point I was making.
thank you, Dr.
Dr. Tharoor, when you mentioned about the imperatives of coalition and the pressure that the government of the day faces, and that only a majority government would have its say, two debates were classic, where coalition governments withstood the pressure both from allies and outside. Be it the WTO, the Narasimha Rao government was a coalition government, or rather, government minority government. Initially, it did acquire majority. It was vulnerable. They went ahead and signed despite the opposition, and then Dr. Manmohan Singh for signing the nuclear deal.
But on the other hand, the nuclear liability law was very strongly impacted by the other parties.
There were two other issues that have to contextualize, because in the debates on Civil Liberties Act was the overhang of Fukushima. Because the Fukushima incident happened in 2011, and this is when people were looking at it. So that overhang would not be missed. And then, of course, comparing it to the Union Carbide case. So again, we keep reading these subjects. So coalition governments have had their say. Narasimha Rao government, in fact, when Pranab Mukherjee as foreign minister, commerce minister stood up and announced, I mean, people are like, how could you do it? You said you joined the WTO yesterday, I went and signed. So there have been instances where Rajiv Gandhi got into trouble on IPKF. He had brute majority. And it was replacing government which brought back because of political change that happened. So there have been situations.
In the case of IPKF, we were actually suffering casualties daily. It's a different story. When the force was sent in, Parliament had no objection, and in fact, we did not object. There was no mechanism to object, because no law was passed to permit the IPKF to go.
It was an FA to comply.
Exactly. Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, executive policy. Same would happen if tomorrow this government wanted to send somebody, but the difference is this government, the way it's run, has a far more secure ability to impose its will on its own members, and now in this particular version, the third NDA, it's allied.
Yeah, my limited point was on coalitions and
let's look at the Nuclear Liability Act when they come with their amendment. Let us see if they are vulnerable at all to public criticism within Parliament.
We'll wait for that.
Yeah. Because an amendment will have to be discussed and passed.
Yes.
But they have the majority to pass anything they want.
But by the way, if you remember, there was a debate when the insurance bill was to be amended and the Patent Act was to be amended. The Patents Act, which was linked to the WTO, the BJP in opposition opposed to it. But when it came to power, it had to, under Prime Minister Vajpayee, and facilitated by the Congress supporting it, because they said in one of the statements not related to this case, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, as leader of the House, tells the leader of opposition, just because you change sides, you cannot change positions.
We all know that where you stand depends on where you sit.
Sir, is the UN Charter is or unfit for purpose in the backdrop of Ukraine conflict? Shall I repeat?
Yeah.
Is UN Charter is
Yeah, hold it a bit closer.
is UN Charter is outdated or unfit for the purpose on the backdrop of conflict and Israel and Gaza conflict? And this is the first question. And second, US curbs on US aid. How India going to affect?
How?
How India is going to affect US aid? They are curbing on US aid.
Okay.
And last question. And recently there is a controversy in the parliament. First Indian foreign minister going to the abroad and lobbying for invitations to the prime minister.
Look, on the very first one, I mean, the question of outdated is a point of view. The UN Charter undoubtedly reflects the historical and political realities of the time in which it was adopted. It was 1945. It was adopted not only at the end of the Second World War, but the end of a 45-year period that had witnessed two world wars, countless civil wars, mass displacements of millions of people, the Holocaust, and Hiroshima. So the entire mood was, how do we ensure a world where this never happens again? Secondly, even though the media called them the Allies of World War II were known as the United Nations from 1943 onwards. So the United Nations was a victorious military alliance converting itself into a peacetime body. And they assumed that they would stay united. As you know, the UN Charter essentially became infructuous within a year or two of its adoption because of the onset of the Cold War. And with the Cold War, there essentially became no particular opportunity for the various provisions of the Charter, such as an effective military staff committee directing operations around the world, for having the military strengths of the major powers working jointly to impose peace. All of that became completely infructuous. So you could argue by 1948 the UN Charter was outdated. It didn't matter because it reflected a certain set of intentions in 1945, and you could then creatively interpret. So Dag Hammarskjöld invented peacekeeping. You look at the UN Charter, the word peacekeeping doesn't exist. He invented it, and instead of the big powers sending their armies out jointly, he created a totally different concept where the small and medium powers who posed no threat to the superpowers, they became the ones who went out and did peacekeeping in the name of the UN. It was an extraordinary initiative. But the idea was very much that you don't allow the charter to become a straitjacket. Instead, you allow it to become a springboard to do whatever you could do, whatever the traffic would bear, whatever international politics would permit you to do. That was the great strength of what happened at the UN at that time. So in that sense, you are not limited by the charter. The charter gives you a platform from which you can take off if you have the capacity, as Kofi Annan demonstrated many times, and as perhaps one day some creative people at the UN might find other opportunities. But on Israel, Gaza, if you say that you have seen some serious challenges to a number of the key notions of the UN Charter, that is true. You could argue that was also true with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was also a violation of state sovereignty, a repudiation of the inviolability of borders, and a rejection, inadmissibility of the use of force to settle international disputes, all three of which are cardinal principles of the UN and part of our punchil in our foreign policy. And they were all violated, but we never said anything. So I mean, that is also something that happened. And you could go even further back and say 2003, the American invasion of Iraq was also a violation of state sovereignty, also a use of force, also a violation of borders. So, you can find examples, but the charter remains because it is extremely difficult to amend. Amendment requires a huge amount of political will, which is essentially not there for anything. So to this day, the UN Charter contains a reference to enemy states. Who are these enemy states? The second and third largest financial contributors to the UN, Germany and Japan. But it's too much of a hassle to sit around amending the charter to delete those words. You left them there. And even Germany and Japan, it hasn't stopped them from giving so much money to the UN every year. That's the other. Your second question, I've already forgotten. US aid, strictly speaking, India is not at all a recipient of government-to-government aid from the US aid. Once upon a time, it may have been in the 60s and 70s, perhaps, not even the 70s much, but certainly not in my short-term recollection. But USAID does finance individual projects in India of institutions, NGOs, civil society bodies, and they will hurt if they are actually working with and helping Indians in need, whether it's particularly poor, marginalized communities, healthcare projects for poor and seriously ill people, all of those things, those will be affected. And that ultimately, I think, what the US has said is not that they're canceling it all, they said they're reviewing it. On the other hand, the very fact that the USAID website and Twitter handle and so all that have already been shut down, this does suggest a certain air of finality, which will undoubtedly worry the recipients of their aid. So it's not a government-to-government India-US issue. It is a donor-to-recipient issue, which will affect some of our people.
Yes. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor Taror. My name is Margus Solmson. I come from Estonian Embassy Deputy Head of Mission.
Sorry, from?
Margus Solmson, Estonian Embassy. Estonia.
Estonian Embassy. Estonian Embassy, right, okay.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion and presentation. I just wanted to come back to the question about ending the war in Europe, because there has been several ideas and statements that war could be ending from the 21st of January. Then there has been a question about 90 days, and there has been certain willingness and support by the Indian government to support the process that would lead to the peace. So is your current assumption, as we know that there has been several meetings this week taking place also in the other side of the ocean?
I think there are three comments to make. The first is that certainly you're right that India could play a constructive role for peace, and it's striking that the Indian Prime Minister is one of the very few world leaders who has been to both sides of the conflict, who has been to Russia and been to Ukraine, has met the leaders of each country, has talked to the leaders of each country, and has witnessed firsthand the horrors of the war. Secondly, it's also true that public statements have been made welcoming a possible Indian role. And I don't think there is any lack of willingness on India's part to play a constructive role. Having said that, and this is where the third comment comes in, any peace requires willingness on both sides to want to make peace. A mediator never imposes peace. A mediator capitalizes on either the exhaustion of the parties or on the parties' willingness to look beyond their entrenched positions. Now, I think it's also a question of timing. I think initially when India had expressed a certain interest in going to both sides, talking to both sides and so on, at that time, it was already, I think, becoming clear that a very major new factor was going to arise with the US election results. And certainly with Mr. Trump's election, the attention has moved away from any other particular power to the role that the US might play vis-a-vis, particularly Russia. As you know, the media is already talking about the possibility of a fairly early meeting in the next few months between the presidents of the US and Russia. And clearly, if that happens, this is going to be the number one issue. So I think there is going to be a reluctance on the part of anybody else to discuss peace with a third party when this big sort of party is coming down the road. So my own assumption is that if there is such a thing that is being arranged, that is where the focus is going to be. And it is only if that option were not there that there would have been any serious willingness on the part of both sides to invite India to come in and help them. But though there has been no official statement from the government of India, and though, as I stressed, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, I believe that there would certainly be no unwillingness on the part of India, and I don't think there's any political difficulty within the Indian political space for India to play a constructive role in bringing about peace. We're proud of the fact that we are a peace-loving nation, and if we can help promote peace between any two warring parties, and particularly one where there's been so much suffering and destruction already, I think it would be applauded on both sides of the political divide.
Just, Tarun, non-alliance has been the bedrock of Indian foreign policy all these years, from Nehru's time onwards. But now we are into an era where multiple alliance is playing a big role. And Foreign Minister Jaishankar says that we are smart enough to have multiple alliance. What do you think about that?
Well, actually, I came up with the concept myself. I first used it in speeches in New York when I was in the UN, that we are moving to an era of multi-alignment. And when I was MOS here in the MEA, I actually floated that very term. And I must say, it sank like a lead balloon. No one liked it at the time in my own government or my own foreign service, and it was never picked up and forgotten. So I was very amused, and I wrote an article saying how amused I was when the other party, in the form of Mr. Jaishankar as foreign minister, picked up that phrase and has been using it. Because I genuinely believe that this is exactly the kind of era we are in today. We are in a world that is no longer a binary world, as was characteristic of the Cold War, when you had US versus the Soviet Union, and non-alignment was a way of carving out a viable space for yourself without being on one side or the other of this binary divide. Today, there is no binary divide. There is no, not yet anyway, two superpowers to choose between or not choose between. In any case, even if a new superpower is rising in the form of China, we can't entirely be neutral to a country that's sitting on our frontiers and nibbling away the land. So it's not the same world. It is much more the world of the World Wide Web, a networked world, where you are connected. I'm connected to him for one particular purpose and issue. I'm connected to him for another purpose and issue. The two of them may not be connected to each other on any that kind of multi-alignment is what but I often joke that we have the foreign minister meeting with his Russian and Chinese counterpart in RIC. Then he adds the Brazilians and the Chinese, and he gets BRICS. Then he subtracts the Russians, and he gets BASIC for environmental negotiations. Then he adds, then he kicks out the Chinese also and gets the other thing for IBSA, South-South cooperation. And India is the only country that's a member of all of these groupings, and not merely because our country's name begins with that most useful elements in any acronym, a vowel, but because this world of multi-alignment, each alliance both means something different to us, and each alliance is one to which we have something different to contribute. So that's the world we live in, PM, and I will say that, to my mind, that is very much an accurate description of the kind of negotiating India has to do in the world today.
Sir, myself Vibhuti. I want to ask three questions very precisely. One is, right now you know the danger of climate change, and Trump stopped the climate change funds. He is not taking any initiations about the climate change policy. He has no interest. So do you think that it will affect his image internationally? And second question is, you have closely seen Sushma Swaraj and a bureaucrat, foreign affair bureaucrat turned to foreign affair politicians, minister. So what is the basic difference between both of them, Jaishankar and Sushma Swaraj, work style? Last question is, Pakistan and Taliban too. There is a conflict already have taken place. Do you think that it will benefit India?
So that's a lot of questions. Remind me again of your first one. Sorry, what was the very first one? What was the first? Climate change. Yeah, climate change definitely. The American attitude, Trump, is one of denialism and skepticism about climate change, which will obviously fundamentally affect the international attitude to this issue. And I would say that because America is itself such a major actor, which consumes such a large share of world energy resources, also produces such a large share of world energy resources. And if I'm not mistaken, despite having only about 4% of the global population, it has been historically responsible for 24-25% of global emissions. In those circumstances, if America dissents from any attempts to promote green technology and to promote climate change awareness and then that will be a major blow to any collective efforts because no one can fence off the climate. Right. It's not as if there's only one portion of the sky or the atmosphere where only America is going to suffer or benefit from that policy. Whatever happens affects the whole world. Global warming affects the whole world. In fact, global warming took place principally in the developed West. We are also all suffering. So, in those ways, I think it's important to say that there will certainly be a major setback for international approaches to climate. But I would equally say that doesn't absolve us of some responsibilities to our own people in matters relating to climate change. For example, climate proofing our country. I mean, a lot of the consequences of global warming are already apparent. I come from Kerala, where we have seen now two major floods and one huge landslide, which have taken very heavy tolls of lives. And these are all directly related to climate. You're seeing the warming of the oceans. You are seeing, therefore, more intense rainfall. And you are also having it hitting our soil beyond the capacity of the land to absorb that much intense rain in a short period of time. That's why you have landslides, for example. Or that's why many of the floods have been worse than expected. So we need to do something in a state like Kerala in vulnerable areas to strengthen our capacity to resist these predictably adverse impacts of climate change. Similarly, we have an obligation in Delhi to do something about our pollution. It's our people who are choking, suffering, losing lifespan, falling ill, uh, undermining their productivity, going to hospital, all of these things. So therefore, we have an obligation. We don't have to care whether Mr. Trump wants to do anything about it. We should do something about it. If countries, cities like Los Angeles and London could overcome far worse problems, so can we in Delhi, but we just have to find the political will and the imagination to do so. I have myself been undertaking a roundtable consultation with stakeholders, including MPs, since 2015, with increasing frustration because there's so little political will to handle it. I'm glad to see that in recent years there's much more public awareness, and I hope that we can move forward on this without too much difficulty. Your second question now was on Sushma versus Jaishankar. It's not appropriate for me to make personal comments, but I will say that one striking feature was that Sushma ji, being political background, was much more concerned about the well-being of Indians traveling abroad, reacting, for example, on social media to messages addressed to her from ordinary members of the public, being really responsible when somebody lost a passport in Paris or was not in Rome or whatever it was. And all of those things, she was out there and interacting a lot more with the public. And as a result, gave a lot of importance to what we would call consular affairs. Whereas Jaishankar, despite having a bureaucratic background, has been much more active on the political aspects of diplomacy and in the articulation of a point of view on the global stage. But thereafter, I think it's all a question of their respective equations with the Prime Minister, because in every government, ultimately, foreign policy is made and stamped by the Prime Minister. Foreign Minister is an executor, is an aide, is an advisor. And I think there you should ask Mr. Modi this question and not me. And your third question was on? Yeah, I think frankly, there is definitely an opportunity for us there. I think when Taliban took over, many of us assumed that it was going to serve as a wholly owned subsidiary of the ISI. In fact, you may remember that even before the full takeover of Kabul was complete, the ISI chief had landed there for a visit. So it became very clear to all of us, perhaps wrongly, that this was going to be a Pakistan-managed country henceforth, and that Pakistan had fulfilled its long-held fantasy of acquiring strategic depth by controlling Kabul and Afghanistan. Clearly, that has not turned out to be the case. There have been not only serious diplomatic strains between the two countries, but there's also been fighting and bombing incidents on both sides. Because Pakistan has this whole problem of having created Frankenstein's monster. You create a monster and escape your control. So when they created the Taliban first, they assumed they would be responsive to what the ISI told them to do and didn't tell them to do. Today, Taliban in the form of the Pakistani Tehreek-e-Taliban is hostile to the Pakistani authorities and the Pakistani military, whom they consider insufficient Islamic. And therefore, even if the Taliban in Kabul, Pakistan has reason to feel that they owe something to the ISI and the Pakistani military, the Pakistani Taliban, which has support, succor, shelter, and refuge on Afghanistan territory, is definitely inimical to and is being attacked the Pakistan government. So the chickens have come home to roost, as they say. I will say that in this particular circumstance, India has every interest in reviving its old friendly relations with Afghanistan. I mean, this is a doctrine that goes back to the Arthashastra. I'm not saying anything. I mean, the enemy of your enemy is your potential friend. Then shall we wrap?
One last question here. See, I'm asking you as a Congress party person. In Delhi elections, your voting percentage came down to 21%. It went up by 2% or whatever. But you scored 3 consecutive ducks. No, Nehru, Indira Gandhi, Rajiv ruled the country by scoring 1/3 of the popular vote, never crossed 40%. But are you worried about the future of the Congress party? Number one, breaking away from India and fighting elections all by yourself, was that a wise thing to do? How do you look at the future of the opposition in this country, and what role should the Congress be playing if you had been the president?
Look, no one is going to pretend they're not worried, but at the same time, we were all worried about Rohit Sharma till yesterday. So a series of low scores does not mean that you wouldn't hit a century one day, and I think that that's something that you should be inspired by if you're a cricket fan. So I think those of us, we were all worried about Rohit. He showed us what he can do, and I think we hope that the Congress will show us what it can do. On the question of whether we should have gone it alone and so on, frankly, I'm not part of the decision making on these matters. So I don't think it's appropriate for me to express a personal view. But a decision was made, and many would argue that that decision had its own logic in the events of previous years, starting with 2013 and the way in which the Aam Aadmi Party showed vicious attacks on the Congress Party. And perhaps in some ways that history cannot be wished away. Attempts were made, as you know, there was an alliance during the Lok Sabha, and there was an attempted alliance with the Haryana Assembly, which didn't work out. And since on many an occasion, Aam Aadmi Party candidates did, in fact, take away votes that could have come to the Congress, is it entirely unreasonable to argue that the same thing has been done by the Congress this time to the Aam Aadmi Party? These are questions I'm asking you because I say I'm not part of that particular strategy.
Before I invite INGs to propose a vote of thanks, can I invite Pankaj to present mementos to our distinguished guests?
A memento too?
Yes, we are getting that.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, that's right. That's for you.
Thank you very much.
ING.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Thuru, for coming over, and hearing you has always been a treat, and it's something which I always look for personally as well. And thanks to Mr. Prasad, and I'm sure the book Indian Parliament Shaping Foreign Affairs is something which people are going to read, because it gives a different kind of a thoughts to what actually it's not just foreign policy outside, but within the parliament, how it has gone ahead from the past. So thanks a lot to you, Mr. Prasad, as well. Thank you. Thanks for coming to the FCC.
How are you, Ambassador?
Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you. I said everything.
We were late. So PM Modi is on a visit to France and thereafter to the United States. So how would you rate?
You already have